Well, hello and welcome to Strategos International on Facebook Live. I am Roy Harriman and I'm here with Strategos President Vaughn Baker. And it is definitely the appropriate time for the topic we have today. We're going to be talking about the U.S. Secret Service's recently issued report on mass attacks in public from 2018. And so Vaughn is going to help us unpack that today. Vaughn, welcome.
Thank you, Roy, and excited to be here.
Well, Vaughn, before we talk about the U.S. Secret Service report, I wanted to give you an opportunity to address the two shootings that occurred over the weekend in El Paso and then in Ohio to see if there's any insights maybe that we can glean that will help us in our efforts.
Well, it was a very tragic weekend, and the second one was probably, if we had to guess, a copycat. And in fact, there was a third one that many people didn't know about down in Hillsborough County, Florida, that was actually stopped before it had a chance to take place. Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department became aware of it, and they stopped the attacker before the attack took place. So it could have been a really even worse weekend than what we had. So the two attacks that we did have represent really the two categories of attacker that we have identified over the years. The first is the traditional attacker, the one that's motivated by a grievance. They have a victim-victimizer worldview. That would be the Dayton attack. He had a background where he'd had a kill list in high school as well as a rape list in high school. So he falls in that category, the traditional category. The other attacker appears to be that of an ideological attacker. And that's the other category, style of attack. It's a strong minority compared to the traditional attacker. But the ideological attacker is motivated by either religion, socioeconomic, political, something of that nature. And there's quite a bit that we can learn from these attacks in regards to hopefully preventing the next one.
Absolutely. Well, that's why we're here. We don't want to just lament. We want to learn. And I appreciate the update. Thanks for people who are joining us right now. And again, share your questions and comments. We appreciate it. Well, Vaughn, as we look at the U.S. Secret Service report 2018, looking at active shooters, and by the way, it is a public report. It's available. We'll make sure that it's in our notes. The first issue that we want to tackle is the location of these attacks. Now, often when we think about attacks, schools come up, churches come up, get a lot of media exposure, and those are really kind of the history of active shooter attacks. However, the attacks this weekend occurred at businesses, and as we look at the report that looked at 27 different attacks in 2018, 20 or about 70% of those attacks occurred at businesses. Do we need to maybe rethink our view of who's vulnerable to these attacks and where they occur?
Well, the ones that get the media attention are happening in locations that shock the conscience, the church, the elementary school, those locations. But we do know, and this is not a new statistic this year, every year, the majority of these attacks this year was over 60% occur in places that people work at, the workplace. So in fact, we're losing between 700 and 1,000 people a year in the workplace. So we need to make sure we address it. Now, the reason we don't hear about it as much in the workplace is a lot of times it's 1, 2, 3 people killed. So unless there's a large body count, you're not going to hear about, and many of those are domestic violence related or maybe previous disgruntled workers. So unless there's a large body count, you're probably not going to hear about everyone that occurs in the workplace, but they are happening much more frequently than they are at these other locations. And this year was no different, or last year and 2018 was no different.
So the idea is it's kind of a trickle, like 2 killed here, 1 killed here, 3 killed here. By the end of the year, there's 500 people been murdered in the workplace, but often it's not it doesn't, as you say, shock the conscience of some crazy person barging into a school where there's innocent children everywhere.
Yeah, as far as people losing their life in the workplace, violence is the number 2 pretty much every year. Number 1 is traffic accidents, but as far as people losing their lives while at work, losing their lives as a result of violence is number 2 consistently.
And that relates to the next factor that we're looking at, which is the length of the attacks. Now, if you aren't familiar with this sort of information, it could just look like kind of an interesting pie chart. But what we looked at in 2018, 63% of the attacks, or the vast overwhelming majority, were over in less than 5 minutes. What does that information mean to the person who was under fire at work or school or church?
Well, when we say under 5 minutes, some of them could have been over in 1 or 2 minutes. And that does not sound like a long time for most people until I put you under duress. 1 or 2 minutes doesn't sound like a long time. And for an example, until I ask you to hold your breath for that long. Now you're going to appreciate what we call the value of time and how much bad can happen in a short amount of time. So it really doesn't take much time to cause a lot of carnage. The Dayton attack is an example of this. Law enforcement's getting much better at responding to these sorts of incidents as a result of training. The Dayton attack, they were on scene in less than a minute. However, in that less than a minute time frame, we had 9 people that lost their lives and 26 others were wounded. And if you saw the video footage of the law enforcement response, tremendous response by law enforcement, and they had some hero law enforcement officers that were outgunned from a weapons point of view, but they had the right mindset and some great tactics, and they de-escalated that threat very, very quickly.
The point would be law enforcement is responding more and more quickly. However, there's going to be a point when you can't improve response anymore. And so the people who are there on the ground, like you say, if they have to survive for 2 minutes with 1 or 2 people with a gun or several guns, it's an eternity. So you have to be ready.
Absolutely. And you have to have a plan individually on what are you going to do until law enforcement gets there. One of the worst attacks in history was at the Pulse nightclub, and we actually had an off-duty law enforcement officer that was present when the attack started. So we can't just rely on law enforcement to solve this problem for us. One of the things we say frequently is we have to participate in our own outcome, and that means you got to know what you need to do personally at the organic grassroots level, and you need to teach those that you love those same strategies.
I like that phrase, participate in your own outcome. Vaughn, let's take a look at the behavior of these individuals, which, as I know, is one of your particular specialties. And it really seems like everything in this report confirmed what I've heard you say and that I've listened to in your courses, and that is that it's not necessarily the demographics. So it's not the demographics of the person. It's their behavior. And a phrase is often used, oh, a person just snapped. And what I've heard you say many times is really people don't just snap. The behaviors are there if we know how to observe them. And so with these individuals, for example, 75% of the killers had experienced an event of extreme stress in their life in the previous year. Half had criminal charges. 2/3 had symptoms of mental illness. So you would think that these would be significant tells, but how can we get better at recognizing behavior patterns in people who are risks?
Well, let's unpack that. There's a lot you just said there. We can unpack that a little bit. First of all, we know that almost all bad acts are preceded by bad behavior or body language indicators. So if we can teach people what to do, public places are becoming better and better in the response phase, teaching people how to respond if, God forbid, it does occur. But now what we need to do is wouldn't it be better to prevent than it would to respond? So if we can know what to look for from a behavior point of view, the word that gets thrown out a lot is this idea of profiling. And profiling has got a negative connotation to it. And the reason is because of what has occurred across the country and historically, and when we talk about age, gender, and race profiling. First of all, it's not effective. Second of all, it's not right. But what we can do is a different type of profiling. That's behavior profiling. What are these behavior indicators? And one of the words you brought up is this idea of stressors, the stressors in the attacker's life. And if we look at those stressors, I want you to think of stressors as an inner turmoil that person is going through. And what they're doing is they're escalating. We call it the Avenger cycle of escalation. They're escalating their behavior over a period of days, weeks, months, sometimes over a year. And so they do this through a series of behaviors that we call boundary probing. They're probing boundaries and they're escalating those boundaries. And sometimes people don't recognize it and they don't say anything to it. And then what happens is once they cross the line of those boundaries, then they begin to probe again. And that starts that continued cycle of escalation. So if we know what to look for, the stressors are one of them. About 3.6 stressors. If we look at mental health, financial, and it'd be the opposite of protective factors, which we also look for. And then protective factors are those things that we think of, 4Fs, faith, finances, family, and friends. Are they present? Are they not present? If they're not present, then that could escalate the risk. So we look at both of those things. And then the things that we want to look for that demonstrate or manifest the outer turmoil, how those stressors manifest themselves as outer turmoil, those are the concerning behaviors that we teach people to look for. And if you look at these historically, 83% of the time, the attacker has exhibited behaviors that concern somebody else. So if we can educate people to say something and we can objectively identify these behaviors, we have more of an opportunity. We're creating more opportunities to hopefully prevent these acts.
What you're saying, it all makes sense. If the social structures in their life are in solid shape, they're more likely to rebound from some of this extreme stress. If they're fracturing or if they're not there, then they may unleash. Are, for lack of a better word, normal people able to perceive and observe these kind of things? Or do you need an expert or a psychologist or somebody like yourself that does this for a living?
Well, obviously, those people are more they're trained and they're more experienced in recognizing these behaviors and indicators. However, anybody, if you're willing to educate yourself, you can at least pay attention to some of the more obvious ones and say something to somebody where maybe that would be an opportunity to bring an outside person that has more experience and expertise in to maybe conduct a behavior assessment.
Makes sense. It sounds like the wise thing is to err on the side of caution and make every effort to alleviate risk. One question that has come up, Mitchell Williams, we appreciate it. I don't know if we have the answer, but let me ask. Mitchell asks, do we have numbers for shootings in 2019? And are those numbers broken down in any way, workplace, schools, businesses, churches?
We don't have official numbers yet because the criteria is different for active shooters, what constitutes an active shooter. There's anywhere from, I've heard one number of, there's been 34 active shooter events since Las Vegas. And then after last weekend, I heard a ridiculous number that was put out by Bloomberg that was 250 active shooter events this year. And that was including 3 people that were shot with a BB gun in a neighborhood by a juvenile. But they counted that as an active shooter event because 3 people got shot with a BB. So it really depends on the criteria. But I think the more accurate one is the one that I heard over the weekend. It was 34 active shooter incidents since Las Vegas, which was over a year ago, obviously.
Right. As you say, the devil is in the details, or the definition. You can't take someone robbing a liquor store as an active shooter, mass attack like this report is featuring. I understand.
Yeah, the FBI actually breaks them into what we call phase 1 and phase 2 attackers. Phase 1 are the spontaneous attackers. That maybe it's domestic violence that escalates in a neighborhood or in a home. That would be a phase 1 type, but the ones that we're talking about are the phase 2 attackers, the ones that plan these ahead of time and are looking to rack up a body count.
A couple of comments. One, David Appel says, when we're talking about people that are possibly under stress in workplace or school, look for anomalies. Julie Dahlberg says, engage with people in a supportive way when we do, in fact, discover a stressor in someone's life.
Yeah, I agree with what they both said. Dave, to expand on what Dave said, it's normal versus abnormal behavior, given those same facts and circumstances. And Julie brings the idea of how can we de-escalate a person's stress. One of the things that we talk about, bad guys and good guys, but I will say this, any of us, you and I both, given enough duress in our life without a way to mitigate that duress or enough protective factors present, we're capable of doing anything as a broken person. So what Julie's talking about is maybe we can put some of those protective factors in place. And again, the 4Fs we talk about is faith, finances, friends, and family. And we can engage people in a supportive way and hopefully let some air out of the balloon so it doesn't eventually pop.
Maybe we can be that person, neighbor, family member, coworker who just cares enough to notice. And no guarantees that will stop an incident, but it certainly can't hurt.
Sure.
And it's the right thing to do. A related question. We want to care, but some numbers on reporting and letting people know, or if you see something, say something. And a couple are this. In 2018, of the shooters, 93% had made previous threats. 78% had exhibited behavior that caused concern in others. Do people generally do a good job of reporting things like this, or do we tend to hold back, and why or why not?
Well, many people don't report, for one, because they simply don't know what to look for. They don't understand maybe what they just witnessed was two categories of threats: is a direct threat and a veiled threat. And if it's a veiled threat, they may not have realized it. I just looked, we're working with a client. I was just looking at some threatening emails that one of our clients is struggling with right now. And we're putting together a mitigation plan for them. And there's several veiled threats in emails that were sent that we need to know what to look for. So when we talk about threats, 93% of people do threaten ahead of time, and they do it via either in person or social media is another way. But we also need to know what type of threats to look for as well, whether it's veiled or direct, or what the method of communicating that threat is.
It seems that workplaces are getting more serious about listening and paying attention to threats. I think we discussed one of these cases at one point was someone made some statements like, boy, I'd like to kill so-and-so. And they were confronted and they said, oh, I was only joking. Is that one of the examples of we're not sure if something's really a threat or not?
Yeah, and it gets down to the appropriateness of it. An example of a veiled threat would be maybe a worker that says to a coworker, or at least says it where that coworker could hear, one of these days people around here are going to be sorry. Mm-hmm. That would be a veiled threat, not nearly as direct, but it is something we need to take account of.
A question that often is first, when something happens, like the shooting in El Paso, the shooting in Dayton, Ohio, I think the first thing that comes to mind is we will think, why? And I think we're just trying to make sense of something that doesn't make any sense. How could someone do this? It's always difficult, it would seem, to attribute motives to someone who's become so unhinged that they could become a mass murderer. But the research from the Secret Service pulled out a couple things that I know you're going to have something to say about. So we tend to think of these people as ideological fanatics of some sort, but in 2018, at least, only 7% were identified as people who committed some kind of an ideological-based crime. The large plurality, 44%, were related to domestic problems or personal problems. Another 11% were related to grievances in the workplace, and then there were various other things. How should we interpret this, and how can we use this to help us build safer workplaces, safer schools, safer churches?
Well, the grievances and the motives are something we got to look at, but it really, what we're talking about there is we're starting to understand, when we look at those grievances and motives, what is the worldview of that attacker. And usually for the traditional attacker, which represent the lion's share of these attackers, they have a victimizer worldview. They perceive themselves as a victim their entire life. None of their failures are ever their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. And so the responsibility for their failures is somebody else's fault. And so many times, ultimately, it's society's fault. And so what they do is they see this long list of personal failures they have as the category when they are perceived as the victim. That's the category of failure. The category of success to them, though, is the victimizer. So what they're trying to do by the nature of their act and the location they pick is to transition from that victim category to the victimizer category. So when we see domestic violence and other interpersonal encounters where a person, maybe it's a supervisor or a coworker, those things that are escalating, that's representative of what we call the traditional attacker versus the ideological. The ideological attacker, they do represent a small amount, but those are the folks that many times they maybe plan more. They're not as spontaneous, and the method of their attack could be even more extreme. And like I said, the results of what happened in El Paso, we saw a much higher body count, and that looked like that. It appears at least that was an ideological attacker.
The point is to be ready and to be prepared with a plan beyond calling 911, regardless of the motive of the person. Like you say, in some ways it may matter, but in some ways it doesn't matter what the motive is. The end result is the same. We thanks for all the great comments that people have shared. Vaughn, as we're winding down here, and then we'll be sure to address any questions. This is a lot of information. If you're a school principal, a small business owner, employee, an administrator of some sort, this is a lot of data. We've covered demographics, we've covered behaviors, locations, motives of people, trying to understand and determine whether an employee or a student is someone who is a threat. What are some ways that Strategos can partner with these various organizations to where they do not have to entirely own everything 100% on their own as they're trying to also do their day job?
Well, we could partner with them on the prevention phase, and we do that through either physical security assessments at their facility, look at visitor management practices, we look at access control practices, things of that nature. We can also look at prevention by educating and training their folks what to look for from a behavior and body language indicator point of view. Credential management on the prevention side could be a piece of the puzzle. And then on the response phase, the training piece, policy and procedures. Do you have a workplace violence program? One of the policies that even some Fortune 10 companies don't have is a policy on high-risk terminations. Does your place of business or does your church, does your school have a high-risk termination policy? And what the criteria is this a high-risk termination, and what the process is going to be if we do have a high-risk termination to do that safely in a way that de-escalates. So we can help them in a wide variety of areas. And we'd like to do it on the prevention side versus them calling us and essentially doing what we call calling our bat phone and the 911 for us, in other words. And then they say, hey, we got this issue going on. It's escalated to this point. How quick can you get some people here? We're more than happy to serve in that realm, but it'd be nice if we could get involved on the prevention side as well.
That's right. You can do more good on the prevention side than the essentially FedEx security when you absolutely positively have to be there overnight, right? But if you do, you can.
Absolutely. Now we do that frequently. Our phones at the office, they ring to our cell phones when we're off. When you have a safety and security crisis, you need some solutions immediately. And so we want to be available to our customers and clients that way as well.
That's right. We have a good question here from Jonathan. Jonathan, I'm not going to mangle your last name, but he says, what's a good source for information about recent current active shooter events? I'm looking for something that reports details and leaves out opinions.
Well, that for recent stuff that happens, we try, especially if it's a high profile incident, we try to immediately begin to gather information so we can learn from the past. And that's what we're really trying to do so we can prevent a future attack, and we can learn from past attackers. To do that, you really have to filter out a lot of the slants, the agendas. I already mentioned the Bloomberg 250 attacks, active shooter attacks this year. That's obviously slanted and agenda-driven, statistical based website, but it's not accurate. So if we know what to look for, and most of us know politically based or agenda-based opinions when we see them, and we can filter out that data. What's really good to get less slanted opinions is when we find the reports, usually several months after the attack, we can go back and look at the reports that are generated by law enforcement and the professional investigatory agencies, where we can get some facts that are not agenda driven.
Would examples be, for example, the Secret Service report we're discussing today and the information the FBI puts out?
Well, that in many of the high-profile incidents, they actually release reports specific to that incident, where we can find out. Virginia Tech had a very lengthy and comprehensive report. Sandy Hook, same thing. A lot of these locations, we see these lessons learned type reports where we can really find out and learn from the past, and they're a great resource for getting information. It's not as timely as we would like it to be, but in order to filter through a lot of the misinformation, it does take time to make sure we get the facts.
That's right. And Jonathan, I'll post links to both the reports I just referenced in the show notes today in the comments section, so that you can have those as well.
And the other one I would maybe post is the FBI study of pre-attack behaviors that came out last year. Some great information in there, looking at 63 phase 2 attackers and phase 2 attacks that occurred. You can learn a lot from that report as well.
Glad to do it. We appreciate it. A couple of comments I wanted to acknowledge. Steve Anderson said, our school has used Strategos twice over the past few years. They're an excellent resource. We certainly appreciate that.
Good to see Steve on the Facebook Live show today, and I look forward to seeing him here in the very near future towards the end of this month.
And Julie Dahlberg, when you were speaking about the lack of high-risk termination policies, even in very large companies, said, yes, it's an HR priority, but often it's not in place, which leads me to the question, why would that be the case?
Well, people aren't thinking about terminations, and they're starting to think that way as far as high-risk terminations, but they really aren't aware of what is the objective information and criteria for what clearly defines fairly what is a high-risk termination versus the type of termination where finally somebody says, oh, I got a bad feeling about this person. Well, that's not really objective, that's more subjective. So we work with organizations all the time where we say, when we ask them if they have a high-risk termination policy, they look at us kind of sheepishly and they say, no, we don't. And I said, well, don't feel bad. The majority, a lion's share of our clients do not have that in place. And so we assist them in putting that in place.
Yeah, in this day and age, could there be anything more urgent? Excellent thoughts. Vaughn, any other, I think we've done a great job of unpacking the U.S. Secret Service's findings, as well as looking at the events that happened over the weekend. Any other comments that you want to make before we wind down here? We certainly appreciate everyone being a part today.
Well, we know this issue is not going away. And one of the questions that I was asked in a television interview earlier this week is, how can we prevent these from occurring? And, the most protected person on the planet is the president. And billions of dollars, thousands of people assigned to protect the president, but we still have attacks that take place and attempts on the president's life, people running the motorcade, things of that nature, fence jumpers at the White House. I will say we cannot guarantee that we can prevent every attack. But if we can't prevent, the next best thing is to effectively respond to prevent harm to those that are on scene. The true first responders, as we refer to them. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to increase opportunities to prevent. And we do that through awareness and through education on what behavior indicators we can look for. So we want to continue to research on this topic, and we want all those that are associated with Strategos to share their information with us as well, so we can learn from the past and take a great joy in the ones that we are able to prevent.
Great insights. Again, we thank you for watching today. If you're watching later, share a comment. We'll do our best to address that. We appreciate all the comments and questions. And if this was valuable to you, please share it with someone who it can be a resource to. You can connect with us always at strategosintl.com, which is on your screen here. Vaughn, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to all those that are part of Team Strategos, the community. And we look forward to visiting with you next time.